Brut, New Art on Stage.
Welcome to the 24th episode of The Art of Assembly, a nomadic series of lectures and conversations reflecting and speculating on the potential of gatherings in art, activism and politics. If you missed it so far, you might want to check out our archive with many videos and podcasts and other stuff, art-of-assembly.net. My name is Florian Malzacher. I'm curator and writer and the host of this series. This episode is based on a live event on September 16th, 2023 at the Rubenstein Art Center at Duke University in North Carolina on invitation of Michael Kliën and the Laboratory for Social Choreography. Many thanks for making this possible. So this episode has the title Interwoven Bodies, and I will not talk so much about it because we have 3 speakers and a lot to listen to, and I'm also running out of voice. So my guests tonight are, in order of appearance, political philosopher and literature theorist Michael Hardt, who together with Antonio Negri coined the term multitude, which is very important, of course, when talking about assemblies, and also wrote together with him a book on assembly, and who's describing multitude as a multiplicity of singularities acting together, quote, and a network that is neither homogeneous nor self-identical, and I think that will be quite helpful maybe for our conversations tonight as well. Literature scholar Corina Stan shows that relations are not only constructed by proximity but also by interpersonal distances that have shaped ethical thinking throughout modernity, and in her talk she will focus on the project The Refugee Tales and on tact as a political concept. And last not least, visual artist and director of the Social Practice Lab at Duke University, Pedro Lasch, gives an insight into his works with choreographies of festive gatherings, multiplatform social communication, and other artworks created through interaction. As Michael already said, this edition takes place in the context of Michael Kliën's Parliament, a social choreography in which citizen performers work in silence to hold counsel amidst the elemental concerns of collectively lived experience. And some of you were here yesterday when in this very space the annual Duke Parliament took place, and Michael will join us later for the conversation afterwards also. So how do we deliberate before and beyond language? How do we create relations without words? How are our bodies determined by the spaces we are in? I will leave this question to answer to the speakers, but just give a quote by Judith Butler, who was also a guest in this series, who famously said in her speech at Occupy Wall Street, I quote, "It matters that as bodies we arrive together in public, as bodies we suffer, we require food and shelter, and as bodies we require one another in dependency and desire. So this is the politics of the public body, the requirements of the body, its movement and its voice. We sit and stand and move as the popular will, the one that electoral politics has forgotten and abandoned. But we are here, time and again, persisting, imagining the phrase, we the people." Michael Hardt, you would probably replace the term people with multitude, since the people suggests a singularity, one, while multitude is many and based on differences. And you don't need much of an introduction here, but I will also briefly say, following the ritual, Michael Hardt teaches political theory in the literature program at Duke University. He is co-author of several publications with Antonio Negri, who was also already a guest at the Art of Assembly, including the very influential books Empire and Multitude, and also a book on assemblies. And his most recent books are The Subversive 70s and Bolivia Beyond the Impasse. Together with Sandro Mesadra, he hosts the Social Movements Lab. And tonight you will speak about strategic multiplicities and take a look at the revolutionary movements in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, specifically at the Third World Liberation Front. And I'm very happy you're here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Florian. Thanks for organizing this. This is Michael, too. So I have prepared something just about one concept and 2 examples. The concept of multiplicity as a political concept is what I want to do, and two examples. As Florian said, I've been working recently and working on a book recently about revolutionary movements of the 1970s, and so my examples will really be from that. Part of the premise of the book is that social movements themselves, or political organizing itself, works at a conceptual level. You know, that there isn't a division of labor whereby intellectuals think and movements act. Instead, there's a kind of theorizing, and perhaps on a different register, that goes on in collective social movements. And so in part, what I am proposing today is to try to read this concept of multiplicity through my two examples of movements. Okay, so to start, really, I wanted to propose a principle for the concept of multiplicity. So I'm going to get more concrete as I go. It'll make more sense, I think, once I give you the examples. But I wanted to start with, in a way, there are two multiplicities in action in the kinds of movements I'm talking about. Both the multiplicity of the different structures of domination, the relationship between capital, patriarchy, white supremacy, et cetera, and then also, and it's not symmetrical, the potential articulation among movements for liberation. So the way a feminist and anti-capitalist movement, an anti-racist movement might relate. And I just wanted to start with a principle from one essay that helped clarify for me, written in 1970 by Iris Young, and really what she's trying to figure out and articulate is the concept of capitalist patriarchy itself and the way that an anti-capitalist and feminist movement might function. You know, these are the two sides of this, but only 2 points, which is helpful to start out. And what I'm particularly interested in is her insistence that when one is considering both the two structures of domination and the two movements of liberation, that there be no priority between them. You know, like she will say things like that they must be considered on equal footing, which of course makes sense, and even in retrospect, I think from our own political location is even more so. You know, so in other words, if you were to say, for instance, okay, you know, there's a capitalist structure of domination, there's a patriarchal one of domination, but the capitalist structure of domination is prior, then that's really offering no possibility for a multiplicity. You know, in fact, we have long tradition of parties that do that and would say, we are a socialist or a communist or anti-capitalist movement, and of course we are within that going to consider the woman question or the race question. This is the way it was posed in previous decades. And so she says on equal footing. I guess the other thing what I have to say is that, and so you could say that there is, in some sense, this might be a first approximation, something, at least on equal footing, between the structure of domination proposed by capital and the other by patriarchy. I think it's helpful, though, at least for me, to recognize that she can't be talking or isn't talking about some quantitative notion. Like equality, I think, already poses a difficulty in that. Because there's nothing equal about them. There's no analogy, but there's also no equality. What would one say that the quantity of suffering that is caused by patriarchy is equal to, in some sense, the quantity of suffering caused by capital or by white supremacy, et cetera? I think rather, and this is the important point for me going forward, is that what is created is, and is created strategically by movements, is that there is no priority between either the consideration of the structures of domination or the movements for liberation. So in other words, you could have an anti-racist movement and an anti-capitalist movement, and one would have to create the political conditions by which there is no priority between them for them to create the possibility of articulation and then hence a multiplicity. You could think then, you know, a little bit further ahead, these might be texts that are familiar to most of you, about the Combahee River Collective statement, which in some ways adds many other axes to this question, but then poses in the question of multiplicity. But similarly, you know, like when they say that that we are a feminist and anti-capitalist and anti-racist and anti-imperialist. They have a long list of them. It doesn't mean, you know, I think it's important for their list and it's important for their statement as a whole that there isn't a priority among the different either structures of domination or the possibilities of articulation of the movements. Yeah, because like I said, I think that priority would collapse the notion of multiplicity. Okay, I think you get me conceptually. Let me give you 2 examples which might go better. As Florian mentioned, one of them is the Third World Liberation Front, which was formed in 1968 at San Francisco State College. And it was formed, and the purpose of the front was to demand changes of the curriculum, demand admissions changes so that more people of color students of color would be admitted, so that, and in fact, the strike, so they went on strike. Sorry, I failed to mention that part. They formed the organization and then they conducted a strike. And one of the results of the strike was the formation of the first ethnic studies department, and that was, you know, part of their demands. What I'm interested in for the purposes here is the organization, the formation of the group itself. So the group was formed by 5 different student organizations. There was a Black student organization, a Mexican student organization, a Latin American student organization, you know, other Filipino and Chinese student, you know, so 5 different student organizations. And they call themselves the Third World Liberation Front. Now, it does seem strange, you know, from our perspective, like they're all USers. Calling themselves what the Third World did for them is to, I think, create the conditions under which one could pose the no priority among the different student groups. So in other words, if it were run, if we're instead a union of student groups in which the Black student union led them and the other student groups were somehow following them, that wouldn't have created the same kind of organization, and in my terms here, wouldn't have created a multiplicity. So I guess you can see what I mean, I hope, right, that it's not that, so this is what I mean by strategic here, is that it's not that one can empirically confirm that there is no lack of priority, either among the structures of domination or among the groups. I would say that there is no quantitative way of relating them. In fact, when I like the notion that there is no analogy, you know, that there is no analogy and there is no quantitative relation, okay. But that one can, groups can, and this is what I'm trying to emphasize with this, create the conditions under which, let's call it any notion of priority is suspended. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. And so that a multiplicity can function. Let me give you one other example and then I can stop. Which is right more or less at the same time, the early 1970s in the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. So one of the things that interests me is the racial composition of the Black consciousness movement. And I'm taking my understanding of this and even this description of it from Steve Biko, who's the most well-known leader of the group. And it's a fascinating text where he's giving testimony to an apartheid court where the court is trying some of his fellow comrades in the movement. Actually, he's not supposedly on trial, but he was called by the judges to explain what the movement is. So he's trying to give them a lesson, explain what Black consciousness is to these white apartheid judges. It's a rather bizarre scene. Anyway, and then Biko was detained and was killed in prison months later. But what I'm interested in here is the notion of blackness. He explains that in Black consciousness, there is what I would call, he doesn't say it this way, a political understanding of blackness. He says, for instance, he starts by saying that in order to be Black, you have to be part of the movement. Like he says, a Black policeman is a contradiction in terms. There can be no such thing. Because even if your skin color is Black, if you're a policeman, you're not part of the movement. But conversely, the South Asian, the Indian community, he says, and the colored community are Black, as long as they're part of the movement. So that this notion of Blackness, which doesn't depend on skin color, but instead depends on struggle. You know, so the way he says it is that any South African can be Black except the white population. So there's a limit to this multiplicity. But nonetheless, I'm attracted by the same way that Third World functioned for the students at San Francisco State College for Biko and for the Black consciousness movement, Black functions this way. And then, I mean, we could, Black function in Britain in this way in the late 1970s. There was at least part of what Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy were interested in and working with then was the way Black, for a period, functioned as a racial multiplicity. There you go. So that's what I'm going to stop with this, but I'm hoping all I wanted out of all this was just this notion that multiplicity is a political concept that is in a way constructed by movements, and that there's a qualification for it that has to be achieved strategically, by the movement itself, which is that there be no priority among the component parts. That's all I wanted out of the whole thing. I'll stop.
Thanks so much. A lot to talk about later on, but now we continue with Corina Stan, who is an associate professor of comparative literature at Duke University and the co-editor of the Palgrave Handbook of European Migration in Literature and Culture, which is forthcoming this year, and the author of The Art of Distances, Ethical Thinking in 20th Century Literature. And you have published in many scholarly and public venues such as The Point, Esprit, LA Times, etc. And you're currently writing a monograph on the European self-understanding after decolonization entitled After the West. And today you will connect your thoughts about tact as a political concept to the project of the Refugee Tail Walk. And I'm very curious and happy you're here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Florian and Michael, for the invitation to participate in this event. I will be talking about the project, the Refugee Tales Walk, and you'll be seeing some photos here. They are all from my personal archive, whereas the quotes are going to be from the 4 volumes of Refugee Tales. I was born into an era of military coup and wars and the imprisonment of all opponents of the government. I was born into a country where the new government persecuted my businessman father for his connections to a previous one. I was born into the wrong tribe at the wrong time in history. I was sent to school in the countryside for safety until war broke out there too, between the rebels of the north and government forces from the south. I had to escape school on foot with a suitcase on my head, fearful of passing through enemy territory where women and boys and girls and old men were being raped by soldiers. In the summer of 2019, I spent 5 days walking in the south of England alongside persons who had experienced immigration detention, writers, activists, and other supporters of the Refugee Tales project. At the time, some colleagues and I were researching the history and geographies of human mobility in the framework of the Representing Migration Humanities Lab, where we had invited David Hurd as the co-editor with Anna Pincus of 2 volumes then entitled Refugee Tales. Their project was a response to the British government's anti-immigration policies and the environment hostile to immigration that Prime Minister Theresa May had explicitly called for. Visiting the Gatwick Detention Centre, activists learned that the UK was, and still is, the only country in Western Europe that allows for the indefinite detention of migrants. Around 25,000 persons, about half of them asylum seekers, are detained annually in 10 immigration removal centres across the UK, with no judicial oversight of the decision to detain. The longest time a person is known to have spent in immigration detention is 9 years. Inspired by Canterbury Tales, Refugee Tales was born with the involvement of writers who visited detention centers and listened to the stories of detainees, wrote them down, and published them. The pilgrimage to Canterbury became a group walk along the English coast in the summer of 2015, in a symbolic contestation of the national borders as fixed and the intimation of an embodied alternative, a border of human bodies in motion. When I joined the walk in 2019, we went from Brighton to Hastings over the course of 5 days, during which we stopped along the way to listen to refugee tales, some told by former detainees, talks by journalists and writers, music sung or played on the kora, harps, guitars, and other strings. What struck me the most was the easy sociability improvised while walking with people I had never met. I remember the story of someone from Eritrea who had not seen his children in 6 years, conversations about biking for days in the Netherlands with an elderly Englishman whose stentorian laughter reminded me of someone I had loved and lost to cancer. A young woman from South Asia, estranged from her family after her mother's passing, who was joining the walk from Germany, where she now lived in a community of missionary nuns. The explanations of a lady who told me about the right-of-way rules in England, which made it possible for us to walk on public paths even when they crossed private property. Their experiences of a young man from Sudan, I believe, who had received leave to stay in the UK and was now a social worker helping students from underprivileged communities. I remember music, good food, dancing and laughter, sobering tales, the white cliffs of Dover, silences and the rhythm of our breaths. Walking on shingles on a sunny beach. Along the way, people asking us why we were walking, what we were doing and hoping, many joining the public events, surprised that they had been unaware of the practice of indefinite detention of migrants in their country. In Hastings, we parted ways, anticipating a reunion the following summer. Little did I know that 2019 would end with a pandemic that would make travel impossible for the longest 2.5 years of our lives, until July 2022, when the 5-day summer walks resumed. Next slide, please. You ask how long I have been here. This is now my 12th year, and sometimes I have to count more than once to be sure I have the right number. It is so long. I have been coming and going between the home office and one office after another in all that time. When I say home office, I don't mean I go there or meet anyone, I just receive letters. Do this, do that, otherwise they don't like it if you don't cooperate, let alone if you dare to disobey. Everyone knows that behind the letters there is a list of threats, withdrawal of privileges, detention, deportation. The refugee tales give readers and listeners a sense of what the hostile environment feels like. The conditions of detention are similar to imprisonment: separation from family and friends, isolation, inadequate medical care. Most of the detainees aren't charged with anything, they are simply waiting for a decision from the immigration authorities. The particulars of each story convey vulnerability, incomprehension, and a poignant sense of wasted life. The isolation of the pandemic was conducive to thinking about vulnerability, also, as in a photographic negative, of the myriad forms of encounter and sociability we were deprived of. We were all practicing social distance and isolation, missing the usual balance between solitude and sociability. The numbers of cases of deaths were oppressive, obscuring individual suffering. It dawned on me that over the past century, from difficult times emerged a reflection on sociability in terms of attunement to others, a fine calibration of interpersonal distance, and attentiveness to human individuality. For example, in the polarized times of the Cold War, Roland Barthes was responding to the perceived indifference to life with a reflection on the capacity to make fine distinctions, which he called délicatesse. Before him, during the Nazi era, Theodor Adorno had spoken of tact, arguing that, I quote, "disregard for the irreducible difference of other people can be remedied only through a recognition of distance." Even earlier, in the 1920s, Helmut Plessner thought of tact as extending along the bandwidth of the whole of human life. The only way of fostering potentiality and the inchoate, he thought, was through the creation of an environment of the greatest possible nurturance. Clinging to tact, an heirloom of bourgeois life, might invite skepticism. We often think of tact as supererogatory, a luxury of social interaction that is nice to have but not required. It's about reading and acting in situations where established rules and norms fail because they are too general. Surely, its importance pales when placed next to human rights or moral norms. Natalia Ginsburg, for example, called it a little virtue. And yet, it is a rare category, perhaps the only one attuned to the individual person, to the contingent, to particulars. As I was thinking about tact during the pandemic, I began wondering, can we think of tact politically? Is it possible to expand its purview from the sphere of private life to the context of politically minded environments? The Refugee Tales walk suggests that both questions can be answered in the affirmative. Next slide, please. M wants to be believed, to persuade, to get them to feel the living truth of it and be moved to pity. At first, he thought the plain facts would do the trick, but when he paused in relating them, he looked into faces which were dubious. He was easy to catch out. This now doesn't match that then. He was new to the game, and they were old hands, and to be honest, they said sick to death of it. One case was much like the next in their experience. The harder M strove to be persuasive, the worse he became at it. Knowingly or not, they had stirred an old terror in him. He was young, but his terror was primeval, and now it had woken in him. He muddled things up. Dates, names, locations, past and present intentions. Pretty soon, they hardly needed to ask him anything. I joined the Refugee Tales walk again with my family in the summer of 2022. My preteen and teenage children were relieved to be outdoors and among people and didn't mind too much walking 10 to 12 miles daily for 5 days. Picture about 150 moving bodies, including persons who experienced asylum detention, writers, activists, organizers, students, and other supporters of the project, young and older, born close by or far away, all walking together. Distance is covered in proximity of one another, yet closeness is never without the affordance of personal space. One falls in and out of conversations, not facing anyone, just walking in the same direction with a sense of shared purpose. The pace varies over the course of the day. There are always participants who fall into step with slower walkers, and there's communication between those at the head of the group and the ones who close it. It's an exemplary art of assembly in which one can simply be, free from the imposition of social roles. This is what Pierre Zawi calls discretion, intimately connected to its etymological root, discretio, which means discontinuous. Punctuated by the rhythm of breathing, verbal exchanges begin and end. There's a brief consultation about the day's route, stories from a long career as a leprosy doctor in various parts of the world, whether the gray clouds mean rain down the road, that sweet little cottage on the hill, word games with a walker who turns out to be a singer of early modern music, those carefree ducks on the pond. Detention felt like I had fallen out of time. I like the walk. It's about being present in every single step, right here together, in my body. The weather again. The rain stopped. Anyone want cereal bars? We are really close now. Oh, someone said that before. How far is really close now? Someone shares memory from times of war. A conversation about polyrhythms in African music follows. I remember a tale about a person who, after more than 9 years in the asylum system, finds herself homeless, but is offered a room by a volunteer and the opportunity to go to college in Luz, where they also volunteer at the archaeological library. She reminisces. Next slide, please. I could cope like this, so long as no one poked me with their curiosity. Other people didn't understand. I was not a whole person, more like a set of glued together fragments, a shattered piece of glass or Chinese porcelain held together with cement. Their questions threatened to shatter me all over again, and when they asked, everything leaked out of me, leaving me exhausted. It took weeks, sometimes months, for me to forget what I'd been asked and get back to being able to sleep again, normally, without the nightmares. I was suffering the long-term effects of the endless court appearances, the refusals, the uncertainty, the 9.5 years of a hostile environment, the ceaseless questioning, the disbelieving, the constant reliving of a painful past. The psychoanalyst Henri Fourmentel speaks not of tact but of gentleness, which she describes as a force of secret life-giving transformation linked to what the ancients called potentiality. The connection with Plessner's understanding of tact as indissociable from an environment of nurturance is obvious. She pushes it further, arguing that, I quote, it may become an extraordinary force of symbolic resistance, and as such become central to both ethics and politics. The philosopher Pierre Zawi concurs. His version of tact is discretion, whose political potential is to reveal zones of social invisibility and silence, seeing places, voices, attentions shift, and recognizing that such a shift can be operated by those who are usually not seen, the shy, the anonymous, the subaltern, the homeless, the undocumented. It's about following the world, he says, in the sense both of watching the world, but also allowing others to take the lead. It is in this sense, too, that the Refugee Tales project has evolved with the creation of the self-advocacy group. In early conversations between activists and people with political influence, such as MPs, journalists, radio hosts, and so on, the Refugee Tales volumes were instrumental in familiarizing the latter not only with stories of flight from conflict, trauma, and detention, but also with the existence of the detention system and what it looked like from the inside. In recent years, there has been an increasing active involvement of persons with experience of detention who participate in monthly day walks, public speaking workshops, and other activities that empower them to speak for themselves and forge solidarities. Recently, they participated in a public inquiry about the abuses at the Brook House Detention Center and spoke very powerfully about it on television. What is an art of assembly? Here is the model I grew up with in communist Romania in the 1980s. Our party and its leader had created by fiat a people who was a collective artist, always eager to write a poem in praise of the great leader among leaders, compose a patriotic song about the golden age we had the unequaled fortune to live in, or design an ingenious choreography of bodies stuck in place as dots in one of the letters spelling the name Ceausescu or Romania. I spent the summer of 1989 on a stadium, being filmed along with hundreds of school children for one of those displays that were a fixture of the party propaganda broadcast on national television. None of us were supposed to have individual lives or individual thoughts. We were just dots stuck in our designated letter, spelling the leader's or the country's name, and thus reproducing the ideology in which we were brainwashed. That was a long time ago, but I think it explains in part my fondness for the Refugee Tales walk. The community it fosters is both small and large enough for every walker to cultivate, alongside others, a dance-like spirit, as Pletzner would put it, to move freely in one's mind and in the world. I look at a group moving through a field or across a road, listening to a tale or to music during an event. As we walk, I feel connected and free and exhausted, and glad that I can feel exhausted and free and connected in this way. Let me end with an excerpt from a poem by Canadian poet Stephen Collis, who has been closely involved with Refugee Tales for many years. A single starling is no such thing as one grain of sand or one drop of rain. What is vision? What is harmony? A flock is what we want to be, clustering telepathic collective thought, flesh out so many minds moving, border crossing seas and mountains, though the starling has affinity groups in sevens, just these near a seven in flight to pay attention, sinking, breathing, sevens touching other sevens, calling voices, hear our voices, you do the math, fractal and telepathic navigating by quick moves. Thank you.
Thank you. And now last but not least, Pedro Lasch is a visual artist, Duke University professor and social practice lab director at the Franklin Humanities Institute. He's also director of Duke's Artistic Research Initiative, and his projects and artworks have been exhibited and presented widely at venues, biennials, and festivals worldwide. And you're also author of 6 books and many articles, and maybe to mention specifically the online pedagogical artwork, Art of the MOOC, has had over 65,000 enrolled participants, which is very impressive, and in 134 countries since it launched in 2015. And just upcoming is your first international retrospective that will open at Museo Laboratorio Arte Alameda in Mexico City in November this year, so very soon. And tonight you will be talking about political and aesthetic potentials of masks, of defacement, and how it liberates individuals and collective bodies. Thanks for joining, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Florian and Michael, for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. I will leave the more theoretical concerns for the conversation we'll have here, because I wanted to bring a lot of images, because I think images bring their own meaning to conversations. And so you will see me kind of flipping through, we're about in 29, 30 images, so we have 15 minutes, it should work out. The journey that I want to take you on is one that I've been on myself, and it moves from formalist aesthetics and experimentation with people and relations, human relations, and it moves gradually more into direct and overt area of politics and political action. And so we will start in Brazil in the 1960s, in some cases a bit earlier, and then through the US we will arrive in southern Mexico and then spread back into the rest of the world. This image, there are basically three questions that I would love all of us to keep in our minds as I talk through these images, but also hopefully in the conversation. I hope all of them you'll see have a direct connection to the art of assembly and also parliament and many other things we're discussing today and that we already heard from the first two panelists. The first question is, what is collective citizenship? Second question is, what are we before we are naturalized? And the third question is, what happens to our interwoven bodies when we remove from them this key marker of identity that we call our faces? What is it, a positive development, negative, probably more complex than that, hopefully, right? So these are motivating questions behind all of the images that I'm presenting. What you're seeing is one of the early experiments of amazing Brazilian artist, Lígia Clark, and it's basically, she really wanted to connect, as you see, human faces, but also to complicate vision, right? She already had a sense that to activate a certain politics of the body, vision had to be questioned, and I think that's a really interesting move. She also then started playing with what she called sensory masks. Masks that made the face awkward, weird, connected to other humans and so on, right? But even if only one individual was wearing them, it would really reset perception in very interesting ways. She very soon then started creating group therapy sessions that, yes, aesthetics was part of it, but actually healing was central to them too. This looks quite murderous. She's not actually killing this person by depriving them of oxygen. She basically would create these eggs. She often thought of eggs and wombs, so different kinds of wrapping materials that people could be contained in. But she also very soon started working with the connectivity of bodies, which I think is very pertinent to this idea of parliament, right? As she was not alone in these experiments. Many of the artists of her generation in Brazil were doing like-minded experiments. This is a work by Lígia Papi, and basically it's called divisor, which is divisor, like a divider. Interestingly, it joins people, so there's something paradoxical in the very name of the piece. It's a work, what we're seeing here is from the 60s in Rio de Janeiro, but it's been reperformed in recent times in New York City. This is what they did in Hong Kong in 2013. And it's always really interesting to watch how crowds use this object, and move through social spaces, right? Of course, part of that same generation is Hélio Tissica, who brought this type of formalist experimentation to the favela, right? Where he basically would create these formalist, modernist fabric artworks that were to be used while dancing, samba. And so he and his collaborators would then, at one point they tried to enter a museum, they were not allowed, it's a famous incident of Brazilian art. But what you can see here is kind of a joining, like a wedging together of formalist experimentation and politics, but the politics part was not really set yet. They kind of stumbled into it, I believe, And this is the last piece I'll show by Hélio, it's called Cosmococa. Where it's basically what you're seeing is a bunch of hammocks that people lie in while they listen to blasting Jimi Hendrix music. And what you see projected on all walls and ceilings is images that he took of him basically drawing cocaine lines on LP record covers. So you see Jimi Hendrix, War Heroes. There's also, there's Marilyn Monroe, actually, some of them are pictures, and these are the slides that are being projected across the wall. So, but imagine those entangled bodies in the hammocks just hanging out for endless numbers of hours, And it's an artwork, but it's, of course, a social space, too. Of course, I don't think it would be possible to talk about this without Augusto Boal. Thus far, all of the other artists I've mentioned are visual artists. Boal came to us from dramaturgy, from theater, and his Theater of the Press is probably the most famous thing he did. books like Games for Actors and Non-Actors. And he, but just with Theater of the Oppressed, he was of course in dialogue with the notion of pedagogy of the oppressed, of Freire and so on. But he did these really interesting exercises. This one he called the Greek exercise, which is basically, I don't actually know why he came up. I don't think, does anybody know where he explains it? I don't think anybody has picked that up. But he just called it the Greek exercise. And it actually works very simply. The idea is that there's 2 active agents, sometimes 3, very few. And in that group of people, everybody else, their job is to facilitate the movement that the others are trying to do. So if a woman is trying to lift her foot, the others see, oh, she's trying to lift her foot. So they help her lift her foot. And so you see this person floating there. She gradually got that high up because people were kind of guessing her movement and aiding it, right? So it's a really interesting exercise if you ever want to try it. He did so many different group exercises that have to do with interwoven bodies. This image is in Paris in one of his workshops in the 70s. And you know, soon enough, these kinds of thoughts also came to the US. Feminist artist Suzanne Lacy was really influenced by Boal, and she created this, what I think is an incredible artwork of the 20th century called the Crystal Quilt, where against this kind of macho architecture of Chicago, you know, with all these glass corporate buildings, she sets, you know, this quilt, you know, this of older women who gather, so there's a mass, but there's also intimacy. Each one of these groups of women are having intimate conversations, right? And their hand movements are kind of very mildly choreographed, but still with the freedom of multiplicity, right? So I think it's kind of a fascinating set of echoes to what we've been hearing. I've been, of course, greatly influenced by all of these artists, but in my personal life, the rise of the Zapatistas were crucial. I was quite young when it happened. I immediately kind of struck up solidarity. And only a few years later, I kind of realized this whole issue of democracy and individualism, there's a really dark paradox there. And the Zapatistas really made clear to me that we had to figure out the thing of collective citizenship, you know? Of obsessing less over individualism. And basically, when I was running these experimental arts programs in Jackson Heights in Queens, which is the world's most diverse neighborhood, linguistically speaking, over 100 languages are spoken in a 20-block radius. And I founded an experimental arts program there called Art Storytelling in the 5 Senses. And there I started experimenting with these mirror masks that I designed, very much inspired in the Zapatista ski mask. And that series is called Naturalizations, hence the question, what are we before we are naturalized? In that context, of course, that question had resonated a lot with citizenship. In other contexts, it can resonate with Marxist theory, a naturalized object, right, or process. In semiotic contexts, it can mean something else. So whenever I bring this project, that was Ricardo Dominguez. I invited him to perform for my students, you know. He did a Tell Zapatista short story. And so ever since, this is like 20 years ago, I've been going to completely different social contexts, countries, places, and proposing different types of experiments one could lead with these mirror masks. These are some of the earlier ones. We created this dance of mirrors, which was like over 80 children dancing with these, it looked like a folkloric ballet of the 21st century. You know, they had their reflective gowns, and each one of the kids kept their own mask. It's the only time I've ever done it where people took a mask with them, so they still own, each one of them owns one of these masks. I think of it as a book. It's basically a book that needs more than one person to be read. You can't read it alone, you know? But it's also a book whose pages have been spread out in time and space. This was at the UCLA Labor Center, where dreamers were getting together for a national strategy action. So I'm just flipping through so you understand the different kinds of contexts. Of course, in each workshop, we had very different dynamics. Some of them last 30 minutes, depending on how much time people have. Some of them last several days. And depending on that, you can do very different things. That was in a Student Action for Farm Workers, which is a great Durham organization. We work together, working in the east of the state with farmer youth. Here you see, of course, the mirrors also can displace objects in architecture and space. They kind of, they merge the landscape with the body and do all kinds of other formal things. I also want to make sure the last few images I'll show bring very specific concepts to add to the conversation. Previous images, I think I'm doing okay. I still have 5 minutes. The previous images you saw, I think, have, in terms of at least the naturalizations projects and the mirror mask, have a lot to do with immigrant communities, citizenship, and so on, right? Class politics. But there's many other topics that interest me when I use this work. This was in Korea at the Gwangju Biennale, and we did a project with 16 Beaver, a collective that I co-founded and have been a part of for many years, called Between Us, which had to do with the militarization of borders, but also micro-borders, the militarization of individual relations, and so on. And so we were using the mask kind of to break some of those barriers. There's also, of course, artistic and linguistic experimentation. Here we see Gertrude Stein, one of my heroines, you know, reflected in the mask. What happens to language, you know, when we do these types of mirrorings and displacements? There's also impossible cases. This was produced for the journal Rethinking Marxism. I created, these look like actual mirror mask uses, but they're impossible. You're always in different places of the world at the same time. It's called media defacements. And psychology is, of course, really important. This was the North Carolina Psychoanalytic Association invited me to do a workshop on Lacanian psychoanalysis, not because I'm an expert. They had their own expert, Alejandro Salamonovitz, who was giving a talk about the mirror stage, many other things, but they thought this would be a really interesting kind of addition, and so it was actually a really exceptional workshop. And the last two images that I'll show, of course, still have the weight of psychology with them. They're about Frantz Fanon. These were workshops I did in 2009 for the first edition of the Ghetto Biennale in Port-au-Prince in Haiti. And what we were exploring with a group of high school students, mostly, some older people too, was the idea of black skin, white mask, a very important work of Fanon's. But many of these students had heard of this, but they never heard it. So I brought some fragments, we read them together, and then through the mask, we kind of took different roles, it did exercises. It was a really very, very rich experience. So one thing that I hope will become clear, and I think this resonates a lot with what Corina presented, is that I don't like using these masks. I mean, I've used them in protests and so on, but I don't like using them. To me, it would make no sense to have them as a mass ornament with like 200 people using. Like if you think of the many years I've been using them, of course, hundreds, if not thousands of people have used them. But it's always an intimate affair, you know? And I respect greatly that type of artistic and political practice. It's exhausting. Sometimes you wish it could be different. But I think that balance of intimacy and multiplicity and kind of a large number of people, because we want a large number of people to be, you know, having their needs covered, you know, but also that need for intimacy. That's central for this work. I think I'll end there, and thank you all.
Well, thank you for your talks. It's quite a bandwidth of approaches, so we will see how we can interweave them or not. But first, I would like maybe to ask Michael Kliën to bring in the Parliament into the conversation. We mentioned it in the beginning, the Parliament that was happening yesterday in this space, and maybe you can say a couple of words and maybe already link it to some thoughts.
Yeah, loads of thoughts. I try to keep it short and not having them all at once coming out. Yeah, the work Parliament sort of signifies my first explicitly political work, I think, as an artist. Before I've been concerned with a lot of ecological thought and kind of disclosure of reality through movement. And I think I just called it Parliament, not really knowing that I'm explicitly interested in Parliament and in political structures. And from then on, and that was 10 years ago, so I had like 10 years to now. I finished this trilogy, Parliament, Amendment, Constitution, and I feel like, okay, I'm done the work over 10 years to read myself into this field, but also to really try to connect, kind of create a petri dish of politics in a way that is starting on the level of the body, on the awareness of the body. When you say truth is concrete, and I hear these very concrete discussions, I always feel like, ooh, I'm like so not concrete. You know, like it's such a fragile situation that I'm setting up, or that I'm interested in, because what Parliament is you create the conditions, you set up a frame in which things then can happen, that sort of peels back a little bit and allows people to negotiate their reality and their reality vis-a-vis each other from a kind of different place, where the social niceties, the social I'm okay, you're okay, sort of fall away, where we lose our codes that have been, that might be relatively young in our socialization. And that opens up completely new fields of relating and feeling things. And it potentially creates, and it's not a utopia, so it might go wrong as well, but it creates this kind of place where intimacy is present. And what Pedro is talking about, this kind of an intimate place in which maybe I like to think that the social unconscious can be addressed, can be affected in some strange way. I just read this book by Bifo Berardi about the third unconscious, and that it's sort of, I like this formulation that we really orientated, so the social unconscious is orientated towards destruction and how to bend it differently, how to, this question of how to bend that differently and how to come together to bend this social unconscious that is almost unreachable. So when we say, how do we create the conditions? I feel like if we use the known, we're just going to replicate. And how do we use stuff that we don't know? How can we even find access to the things we don't know to organize our affairs and start organizing them? And my observation is, even though it's not concrete, it becomes very quickly concrete if you grow it into institutions or into educational ventures or into situations. It becomes very, very concrete very quickly. And Parliament has been going for 10 years, and now we have an annual Parliament at Duke, and it really has been growing as a community, but it's also grown as a practice across different countries and different communities to do exactly that, to practice a different kind of relationality. And in a way have this, I always think of it, there is some multitude. I would love, Michael to be part of it once to see like, how does it really kind of go together? But it is very, it can be intimidating, I think. And I think lots of people did Parliament. It's a strange thing.
Parliament is an interesting example, I guess, and an interesting setup for what we are talking about tonight, since the audience members are the only performers, and you, Michael Kliën, even leave the space, so we have to negotiate our relationships ourselves and without words, and this leads to questions that we are busy with in many ways right now, I guess. So how to negotiate proximity and distance, singularity, individuality and collectivity, and how do we create equivalences in a time where we actually should or would need to fight together, while very well acknowledging differences, of course. So let me come back to our starting point and the question of interweaving bodies. We had several very concrete artistic and activist examples of analog situations of sharing space and negotiating proximity. And we had the concept of strategic multiplicity that you offered, Michael Hardt. So how do we bring them together? Does bodily presence play a role for you in your concept? It was already mentioned another concept of yours, the concept of love as a political category. Is that maybe a link, or how would you create a connection?
I wonder if when, even in the, I guess it was you, Florian, who read the Judith Butler presentation from Occupy Wall Street at the beginning. I wonder if when bodies are evoked, they're a stand-in, in this context, a stand-in for the notions of differences more generally. So, because I don't think there's really, in the way you're posing it, also in the way I was just thinking about her quote there at Occupy Wall Street, it's not that in the contrast to the mental or the intellectual that the corporeal has, there's equal number of differences in the realm of of thought too. So I was just wondering, I'm really wondering what the nature of body is when we're talking about this. Of course, I mean, I'm in the wrong context because those of you doing the artistic work are foregrounding the corporeal. But still, I'm wondering if I'm. This is really just a question for me, and maybe it's a stupid question. But if it's not really the corporeal that's at stake, but rather something that it's a, like I said, a stand-in for, a signifier for, something like that. A refusal of homogenization, that the corporeal is a way of refusing that. Yeah, something that's.
Yeah, that's good. So we'd pass on the questions to you too.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting observation because even, for example, with the images that I showed, I would say that some of the works are actually not maintaining multiplicity. Like that big fabric of Ligia, you know, you could say that's homogenizing, you know, et cetera, right? So there's a complexity to how that body is used as a cipher of, you know, singularity. But I feel like the one thing that I've discovered over the many years of using the mirror mask is that many people immediately want to take them off. Like their first response is they put it on and then, oh my God, what just happened? And when that first happened, I thought everybody would love it right away. And then I was like, why did they hate it so much? And then they put it on and they play, so people realize it's a game and they're fine with it. But think of losing so many things that we've been attached to on our face, you know, whether we like it or not. People project so many things on us. We project it on ourselves when we look ourselves in the mirror. And so when that gets removed, race, gender, age, all of these things, right? It's terrifying for some people, right? And that in itself, even before you start using the mask in the group, to me has been a really interesting experience, you know. And then we often have conversations in the workshop about that phenomenon itself, which tends to repeat. But it's in a way that political understanding of race, for example, that you brought up with Biko, it's the same. I mean, I would compare it to Haiti, and like when Haitians first win their revolution, their first constitution says "Nous sommes tous noirs," we are all black. You know, they were perfectly aware that there's a range of colors and so on. So they're not talking about skin tone. It's a political definition of who we are. Right? Before we were forced to be white when we obviously were not, you know. Now we're not, we're black, you know. And so I think it's an interesting apparent paradox, right? When the images speak of bodies, you know.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting that you're removing the face, right? You still have the rest of the body, but the individuality of the face is removed. But I wanted to ask you, so could you say more about the experiment itself? So how do the participants interact? Are they interacting verbally, or are they just looking at each other, and what exactly happens in the experiment itself?
I mean, it depends. I've never figured out the wisdom of this man, of like letting it happen and disappearing, because that's what he does in Parliament, you know, which is something that I hope we can talk about at some point too, because I do think the kind of more radical political aspects play out better that way, you know, when people are not looking for the authority, the artist, like what should I do now, you know, et cetera, which you kind of liberate people when you walk away, you know. But in my case, I've never figured that out. I mean, there have been some workshops where people check out the box and they can use it however they want, and then they tell me what they did with it. But it hasn't been in Documenta. In the last Documenta, it was kind of successful. But you know, most of the time, I ask a lot of questions before I go anywhere with this project. Who do you think will be coming? Where are we? So whether it's a group of Bangladeshi high school students in an outskirt of London, you know, where the hijab, of course, is an issue. You know, like, so I basically create each workshop on who I think will be there. And then with experience, I've learned to adapt to how it goes, you know? And, but some of the workshops are intentionally silent, kind of like Parliament. Others are based on, what I tend to do is at the beginning, I just let everybody play with it to break the ice and to have that experience of collective, of becoming a collective. And then after that, we have more programmatic, you know, things. But at the end of each workshop, I ask people, if you have any ideas of what to do with this project, let me know. And that's, I think, why 20 years later I'm still working on this, because I never thought, I usually get bored with work, you know? And with this one, I'm still doing things, because usually people come up with their own ideas, and then we work together. So it leads to a lot of collaboration.
Well, in some ways it resonates with refugee tales in that one aspect that really strikes me and that I mentioned is that people don't really face each other when they walk, right? And the body then becomes the great equalizer. We walk together, we get tired together, we walk in the rain and we get drenched together. We are hungry, we need to have some food, we need to sit down, we need to do all of these bodily things that we all need. And in that, the Judith Butler quote really resonates, right? As bodies we suffer, we seek shelter, we desire, and so on. Right? But it also strikes me that even this aspect of the removal of the face then transforms the body into a thinking body, just like in Parliament. And when I first participated in Parliament, I was really struck by that notion of a thinking body. So don't look as much at the face as at the moving bodies around the room and trying to interact with them in non-verbal ways. And when you remove language, then interaction becomes very different. You have to resort to other modes of signaling, of relating, of, at some point I was pretending to sit next to somebody who was on a chair, but I didn't have a chair, so I just pretended to sit down as if I had a chair underneath. And so that was not about the face, and it was just about the body, right? So it's interesting to become a thinking body, but it strikes me that in these experiments you have to remove something in order to see what difference it makes, right? And then you can ask questions about naturalization, or about what it means to interact, or what it means to be together in a space.
I perceive it not so much as removing anything, but actually letting, stopping something that is persistent, actually allow for a much broader voice, for much broader knowledge to take hold. So it's almost not doing something, but it's actually letting the other stuff do more. The other knowledges, the other senses, your being in the world. And in a way, I feel like our social conditioning has really allowed a very narrow spectrum of social organization to emerge. I mean, it's very brute. It's like we put stuff in boxes, we put curriculums into boxes. It's really dumb. Our social organization is very boxy and hierarchical and surprisingly, I don't know, I wouldn't call it intelligent. It's just very brute and simple. And you go like, this is the best we can do. This is the best we can organize education and curriculums. This is the best we can organize the state. This is the best we can organize human affairs. And it's like almost ignoring the complexity of an organism. That organism, that our territory, that is us, is so complex and so beautifully organized. And there's so much wisdom in that organization. I mean, our mind thinks in that beauty. And so to actually access and translate that organizational skill and start setting people, or let people setting themselves in relation to each other according to that knowledge, I think would yield or would rent a different kind of reality. When it does, it's a saner, and it's absolutely a saner reality. Now, can it be sustained? I don't know. It feels really embryonic, the things we're working on, but it's there. I mean, it's real, it's felt. I can feel it, like it resonates, it has like it glimmers, it's there. And I think loads of people can feel that there's something else there.
You were saying before, I think that how to translate this to an institution, or and we, in some conversation we talked about, let's take this one, Duke University. So how would the concept, the ideas you all presented, how can they be implemented, or should they be implemented? What would it mean to translate this concept to a concrete organization? And maybe let's take the university, since we're in one. It could be about other organizational structures, I wonder. So how would strategic multiplicity work in Duke University, for example?
I know. But I was thinking. I mean, this is too unintelligent a way to start. But it's by nature an elite privileged institution. I think what I'm thinking about, and I'm interested in these multiplicities of struggles for liberation. And so, I mean, one could do it within such a context. You know, there have been, but not at the level of the institution. And one would have to destroy it. Then you could start. So, okay, that would be my answer. Yeah, first you'd have to destroy the institution, then
So,
you could
okay.
start.
When you have destroyed it, how is there a way?
Well, you would do something different.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
but where to start? So, where, and also is there not? I mean, there will not be a tabula rasa in the world. It will not.
Of course.
So
No, I mean, I think rather than trying to invent such things, it would be better to look at what movements are doing today, and maybe where they're succeeding, where they're failing. Like, I don't know, what would be an example? I mean, so one could try, let's see, one could start back with Occupy Wall Street and talk about the ways in which there was both raised and failed questions about race and gender within Occupy Wall Street. You know, the attempt to create such articulations among movements. That similarly, I mean, in some ways with the Gilets jaunes and before the pandemic in France, that there was a lot of attempts at and talk about convergence among the Gilets jaunes themselves, the work protests around retirement, pensions, the racial movements in the banlieue, feminist and ecological movements, and an inability to construct such multiplicities. That might be the way to start, like about what the problems that movements are facing. Yeah, so anyway, that's where I would start rather than trying to propose how one would invent such things. It would be rather trying to start from the problems that are recognized by participants within the movements themselves. Because I think this is recognized as a problem. That's what I would, you know, the problem of convergence, at least that's the way they pose it in France. I think it's the same problem I'm posing with this question of multiplicity.
just a second, I just want to insist a little bit, because as a university professor that you are, so you're not part of this, in this job, you're not part of this struggle, or is it a separate, or is there something that you're trying to do in your work as a professor, for example?
No. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I've conceived it for the last 30 years that I have a day job and I have a night job. And they aren't the same job. And one of them has a salary attached to it. But that's, if only, although I don't think it's appropriate, actually. I think I have good reasons for keeping them separate.
I mean, yeah, I think those of us who know you will respect that, you know, but also people do read your work and they do with it other things, and they may be on the campus, you know, and so there is a porosity to that, you know. But, you know, I think that there's many different positions on that on our campus, you know. So to give you an example, this was right before COVID. 9 undergraduate students occupied the Allen building here, which is the building where it's the powerhouse, you know, it's where all the deans are, the, you know, the provost, et cetera. And if you look at who those 9 students were, they were not political science students. They were actually, 3 of them were my students. They were taking art classes. They were, you know, they were taking lit classes. You know, they were probably, they would have come to Parliament, you know, like they were that type of student. And so I don't think we can minimize what we're doing together at times. They also weren't alone. This was a movement across the US of student occupations that, of course, the media shut down. They didn't talk about it as such. But there were hundreds of occupations on US campuses in that year, you know? And so I do think that is a more direct traditional politics, right? It doesn't necessarily resonate with some of the stuff we've been talking about. But what I greatly respect of those 9 students is they very much, I think, resonate with what you were talking about of the no priority. They really insisted. I mean, their songs were long. You know, they were like, they had to fit everything in there because nothing could supersede the other thing. So I think it's an interesting. There is some resonance. You know.
Also to come back to this question, and with your work, the work that you presented. So keep the microphone, please. Just to get a bit into that, the work that you presented, and I know that's not a very fair answer, a question to an artist, but since you're an activist as well, so is there something that from your experiences with the mirrors, with the mask, with the defacing, could be scaled up or could be implemented into institutions, or propose a different kind of institution? Or is there a gap in between your artistic work and the activist work?
I mean, I sympathize with Michael's pragmatism in terms of our day jobs, you know, but at the same time, I do try to subvert things from within the institutions constantly. I just don't tell people what I'm doing necessarily, because I think they will shut you down. There's no mystery to it, you know, so there's a lot. If you want to transform institutions from within, you need allies, you need covert stuff, you need, you know, I think we would be naive to think that you don't get shut down. And so I feel like that's different than doing these aesthetic experiments that may have a political outcome, but it's a very soft political, it's not an agit prop. Parliament is not that, you know, and so in terms of the mirror mask works, we have used them at protests where they do have that function of protecting yourself from facial identification. That's a very specific function. But that's different than confusing our subjectivity and having fun and going out for dinner afterward, you know, completely different types of politics. I generally, probably the closest is where I feel with Michael is this idea that our society is so stupidly organized, and it's so boringly organized, and so uglily organized, you know, that we have to come up with better things, and this is just one try, you know. I mean, one thing that I also liked about the walk thing, you know, it's kind of, there's this anti-linearity in a lot of the stuff that we're doing, and so I was trying to link it to your no priority thing, right? So no priority is no linearity to a certain extent, no historical narrative, blah, blah, blah. And something, I do a lot of walks with my students, and it's fascinating to me that almost every group that I've ever taught with a walk, they forget to plan the walk back, right? There's just something circular about, you know, or at least they have to figure out where you're gonna end up, because, or who's gonna pick you up. And so one thing I love about the Refugee Tales is that where you walk actually is not that important, you know? Maybe I'm falsely assuming that how did you choose the different places that you walked between and from? Was there significance in that?
Yes, yeah. There is a core group of organizers, and they actually plot the walks beforehand, and they do them several times to make sure that it's realistic to make them with 150 people of various ages and let's say fitness levels. And there are stops on the way, so they make sure that, you know, there will be adequate resources, even, you know, bathrooms and drink and so on. So they are very well plotted out in advance. And what I have not mentioned is that people sleep at either community centers or at churches. So there is usually a truck with sleeping bags and everything one needs for sleeping, and then that truck moves from a place to the next, and all the equipment is already there at the end of the day, and then at the end of the day's walk. So that's how it works. It's actually very well organized, thanks to a group of dedicated volunteers.
You were also mentioning the question of quantity, in a way. How many people can it take? Which maybe relates to also to the question to scaling up or to institutionalize. Or so why do you think or what can this number of people do there, and what would happen, or how could it be translated to bigger groups, or would that automatically turn into the nightmare of masses that you also projected?
The question of number is really interesting, also with respect to Parliament, and also with, you know, multitudes, which I'm assuming does not have a limited number. Right? When I started working on distance and thinking about distance, the model that I had in mind was the ideal community that Roland Barthes imagined as one of 8 to 10 people living together. And he thought that that's how many people could actually get to know each other reasonably well, not get bored with each other if they cultivated this nice balance of solitude and communal activities. Now we have the Refugee Tales walk. It's about 120 people plus 20 plus persons with detention experience. So it's usually up to 150. And I think the organizers, there is a limit to the number, and I think it has to do with the logistics. I don't know if it can be scaled up. I think there are challenges if it's scaled up, very practical challenges. but then it can always be repeated and different groups can do it. And also the logistical problem has to do with whether one can walk in public space or not. It might be a little more difficult in the US, for example, than in European countries. I mean, this is what I learned there, right? That we were actually walking on private property, and people were saying, oh, we really need to walk to keep the paths, right? So that there is a whole organization, the Ramblers in England, I mean in the UK, that makes sure that these paths are well maintained and that people know about them and then they walk on them, which I think is really fascinating. Here, if you go on private property, you risk, you know, the worst. So that's also an interesting question, I think.
I have lots of more questions, but maybe open up to you also if somebody wants to comment or ask something. I will bring my microphone.
Thank you. I'm really fascinated by the spectrum of intimacy and multiplicity, because it seems to me that in order to arrive at multiplicity, you have to have a certain level of intimacy. If you have groups that have basically allowed their status to be go by the wayside so that all the groups have priorities, the only way you can really do that is with an acceptance of the value of others, a sense of empathy for others, and the tact that you brought up. And I think with Parliament, what happens there is you have an intimacy, you have a growing intimacy that then can develop into multiplicity, because you've suddenly connected in a very different way. And there is a sense by the end of a real sense of all of the people in Parliament have experienced something very different, very new, and it has been done with this group of people. And the walk too, I mean, it's a very intimate act, it would seem to me, because you are talking with different people, and even though you join as a sort of a multiplicity through self-selection, by the end of it, there's a much deeper level of that. So I'm just curious what you all think.
Somebody of you want to add something to that?
I don't. I think my notes also had the word intimacy and, you know, sort of underlined. I think there is sort of in a crude analysis, I think that the cultures change either through trauma or intimacy. And so, you know, like a falling in love, Gregory Bateson would say, you only change your pathways of thinking through falling in love or through trauma. And I don't think societal, it's different. You know, you can like to make, and that's just purely speculations. But I think if you create spaces of mutual vulnerability, it allows you to destabilize your thinking, your processes of awareness, of cognition. It just allows you to extend into a kind of new territory that usually is well protected. And so this, how to create the conditions for intimacy within a large scale, I don't know. I know how to do it, or I know how to propose it in smaller scales. So, and maybe it's just a lot of small scales that need to come together. I don't know.
What I would say is that intimacy takes time, and it has to happen under the sign of, as I said, what Pierre Zoe calls the discontinuous. So it can't be imposed all of a sudden, and it has to happen through repetition, through ritual, through multiple encounters, also through the allowance of space and silence.
I'm attracted by the notion of intimacy and your proposal in some ways that in order to accept that another group not have priority, or that is required a certain kind of intimacy, I think that's really attractive. I was wondering in my own mind, and maybe I'm being too instrumentalizing this too much, to try to substitute solidarity for intimacy here. And by solidarity, I mean not just having a kind of empathy with the struggles of others or thought, but rather recognizing that their struggle is our own. You know, so in the same way that we would, yeah, I mean, even there was an essay that I referenced at the beginning that I'd come back to by Iris Young, socialist feminist of the 1970-ish writing, where she says, you know, I have a lot of socialist men colleagues who feel solidarity with the feminist movement, but that's not what I want. I want them to recognize that that our struggle is part of their struggle. You know, so that I'm wondering if I can call that intimacy, though. That's where I was trying to go, or if I'm being too. Yeah, I might be distorting it too much by calling that intimacy, but there's something that echoes of intimacy in recognizing that that there's something interwoven enough about the struggle so it's not a matter of a kind of external solidarity, but a recognition that what we're striving for requires us also striving for that. And so her same way complaining about her male socialist colleagues, that they have to recognize that the feminist struggle is really part of their struggle rather than something different. Okay, I don't know, I was hoping I can call that intimacy. I'm not sure I convinced myself, but I'm attracted by what you proposed.
Well, and maybe to add a few more non-definitions, I feel like, for me at least, and in my work, it has a lot to do with like an unexpected proximity, you know, and also with countering alienation, you know, in a good old, you know, Marxist sense. And I feel like behind the work, the kind of work that we do, whether it's these walks or your thinking and writing, but also Parliament and what I do, there's a lot of social analysis. The rules that you come up with for Parliament are there for a reason, you know, like, and so the activities in terms of your question of how the workshops evolve, I read when I was probably 16, 17, I read Pierre Bourdieu, you know, and I was thinking about habitus and how to create habits that break habits, so that, because I think that our everyday life is the most pervasive thing that puts us in situations where there can be no intimacy. Like, I take my Duke students in their first year class, we go to the cafeteria and we go where those magic trays go that disappear, where you put your, you know, this. And I usually, since I know people usually working behind, I ask them, hey, can I come with my students in a certain moment? I'll just knock on the door and there's gonna be this magical moment, you know? And so, and because I get there, like, where do these trays go? It's like, I don't know, I guess there must be people back there, you know? Well, there's architecture there to not allow intimacy, right? When we were organizing for fair wage, there were people told you're not allowed to speak to the workers. Like, I mean, the workers were told you're not allowed to speak to the students. This was like 15 years ago, you know? And so there are very specific structures in place to not allow intimacy. And I think a lot of what we're trying to do is first identify those things and then figure out ways to disrupt them. And then if we're lucky, add something new that redirects them. At least that's what I try to do.
I was just wondered, because I remembered like conversations, I don't know, quite some time ago, like 15, 20 years ago, where activism and internet, all the possibilities of working together, and the idea of collaboration was very, very strong. And there was one point behind was always, I don't need to know you, I don't need to like you, I don't need to be intimate with you. And it was the idea that this actually could enable completely different ways of activism also and political work. So I'm just find interesting how the need for intimacy maybe came back in this, or how intimacy can also, that solidarity doesn't need, so I wonder, there the claim would be solidarity doesn't need intimacy, it doesn't even need that I like you or know you or whatever, I can be solidaric. So I think this is maybe an interesting tension in there.
I actually want to just, answer a question that you asked like 20 minutes ago about about whether you believe it can build institutions, and I feel like I just should say, because there's sort of like a negative vibe here that I picked up, and my experience, and it's not even hopeful. I don't think I'm hopeful about it. I know it can. Like, I've built an institution, a state-run institution, that on the basis of what I found out working in dance, like working with people and the linear ordering procedures breaking down, making no more sense. You create a different kind of sensibility, and you start thinking about how can that, or how does it resonate? You don't even have to think about it. It's like ethical. It just resonates into your social organization setup. And then you just start organizing differently and very strangely to the other people, maybe. And if you have some sort of course it's a little bit tricky, it's risky, you use a lot of public funding and you build a completely different world. And but it's there, and it actually creates a life world for quite a few people, and for a whole community, for a city, a different kind of life world. And you go like, it's there, so it has to work, right? I mean, you can demonstrate it. Now, is it sustainable? No. Like it does have to, if the difference to the dominant system is too large, then it can only maintain itself in a fairly small bubble, I would say. But it's bubbling up, and so I'm kind of like, no, I think we could build a different educational institution, like, yeah, it could be done. I don't know how to finance it, but that's not my forte, right? Like, I know how to choreograph it or how to create the conditions for it. I don't know how to finance it, so if somebody knows.
There was
Thanks to everyone for all you've brought and shared. Just to follow up a little bit on this discussion of intimacy, and also what you brought up as a kind of a necessity of repetition in many ways of actions to sort of build that intimacy. Thinking about that in the context of Parliament as well, and sort of differentiating assembly with a clear political set of goals or movement from assembly, which Parliament I would call sort of an embodied practice of experiencing or practicing multiplicity, maybe, without goals in mind. And I'm curious, I'm aware that you have been doing it in an iterative way here in Durham and at Duke, and also that you have gone and done assemblies as like one-offs in other places. And I'm just curious about what you've observed in terms of what happens to that embodied experience of multiplicity when it's done in an iterative way, when a lot of the same people keep showing up. And I can see that in a certain way there can be, not to put this in terms of positive or negative, but sort of a value to that iteration and that sort of practice, but I can also see perhaps something being lost in that could perhaps be valuable in a single experience of assembly within that context. So I'm just curious about that, what you've observed.
I totally agree, and I've been thinking about it all night. I literally have, like exactly that problem of if you create something once off, then it has a real effect, there's some sort of what I call psychedelic thunderbolt, or somebody called it psychedelic thunderbolt, that takes you out of your normal socialization and then makes you look at it from the outside and go, oh my God, what's going on here? But then if you develop it as a practice, as some communities have, they use Parliament as a practice, I think it starts, and I don't quite know why. I mean, I sort of know why, but it's still surprising how it actually starts crystallizing its own problems, and from the psychedelic thunderbolt, it becomes its own thing that organizes maybe not that, has its own problems, let's put it that way. It's more complex in organizations, but it shows up issues. And that in itself is interesting. Like I hope that Parliament is not understood as some sort of savior situation or salvation, but one of revelation, like that you kind of constantly seeking for it. I mean, the book Corey Tamla wrote on Parliament, it's called The Permanent Parliament. So it's like a constant seeking and overturning of order and our understanding of order and our understanding of relationality. And so that's how I would like to understand it. The problem is there, the problem is real, I don't know. I'm thinking about it. Like I was like, should I add some more new rules? But then that's a trap in itself. You've seen any kind of state that adds more and more rules the sense of movement actually shrinks what is possible. So that's not a good idea. So it's interesting. These are good challenges, and we'll figure it out with the next installment.
I mean, it's also, I think it's a very pertinent question for an educational institution. You know, like if you're dealing with art production, we often get to do things just once and you move on and you do the next one and so on. Right now, like, that's the habit of art institutions, you know. They don't want to repeat with the same artist, you know. But in the educational institution, we have to repeat ourselves constantly. So like most of my graduate seminars, I pretend like I didn't bring a syllabus, even though I have a syllabus. And I just say, I don't have a syllabus. I have this question for you. Why a syllabus? Why not a different type of intellectual narrative? And then I tell people to look around the room and I say, you're gonna spend the next 15 weeks with these same people and you're gonna see them once a week for at least 2.5 hours. What would you do with that? It's a social structure, right? But it's based on repetition, right? And so I think, yes, if you know that the annual, by making it an annual Duke, you're setting yourself up for that problem, right? You know? But it's an interesting problem, you know, because from repetition, we can develop intimacy over time. We can develop all kinds of really interesting things. But you can also develop what I think is the enemy of, at least in my view, of multiplicity, which is the cult figure, you know? Like there is that danger in repetition too, where like people come to expect the authority figure, you know, and how they were, you know, and so it's a tricky dilemma. But I'm glad you asked it.
Yeah, in there.
Well, I'm very charged with the multitudes of this conversation and have so many different reflections and questions, but I'm going to try to go with just what's bubbling the most to the surface. I am really taken with this notion of nothing being privileged and wondering if that in itself feels kind of rigid, actually, because all of this is so relational. And I'm reflecting on how, like, we just came from Parliament, this dance exploration last night, this embodied exploration, and these embodied and artistic processes that you're bringing to the world, and the need for privilege to also be a dance, where certain needs of certain groups or individuals are privileged sometimes, and then not other times. And that feels also connected to the fact that many groups come from lineages where we haven't been privileged. Like we're all made up of these intersectional multitudes, right? Where parts of our identity maybe have been privileged for generations and parts of our lineage have not been privileged for generations. And so, yeah, I'm curious your thoughts and feelings in response to that.
So part of the challenge of the discussion tonight is that we're talking across a lot of different registers, and sometimes it's working and sometimes it's not. But I think you're trying to bridge the registers in an interesting way. You know, so it seems, or at least I don't understand a always direct relationship between the art performances and the political organizing in groups. But you're posing I think you're trying to do both together, and I find that interesting. So just one thing I would say, which I think is corresponding at least in part to what you're saying, which is an example I have from a movement in Argentina called Ni Una Menos, which is a feminist, they're starting as a feminist movement at least, but working in many different fronts together. And so part of what they do in their assemblies does involve a kind of prioritization, but always in a temporary way. You know, so it could be that there was an LGBTQ center that was attacked, and so all the people, some of them who are normally working in the unions, and some of them are normally working on indigenous questions, on this day they're all focusing on that. Or on another day they're all focusing on something else. But with the overarching, this is what I would say, assumption that there is no priority in principle among the different groups, so that they are primarily a group about indigenous rights, and these other questions, they'll consider them, but they're really secondary to it. You see what I mean? So I think that there can be you make me think of that example where there's a kind of, what should we call it, floating or temporary priority that is understood on the basis of a lack of priority in principle. I'm not sure if I'm using quite the right words. But still, I'm not being able to address what you were trying to address too, which is the artistic practice that is in some sense parallel to these questions of what's going on in movement, is in some sense not. That's what I was pointing out, that the kind of dance, I think, of the discussion of the whole afternoon, evening, wherever we're at now.
That's always when it comes to political art, it's actually, I think this strange bridging is part of it. I would maybe take another question in.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for that. It was really enjoyable. I think my question is primarily for Michael H. It's about the specificity of the 1970s, and in a sense, the failure of these multiplicities that you're talking about. Biko is dead. In many ways, the establishment, as according to Gary Okihiro, right, the establishment of ethnic studies was a complete banalization of the third worldist movement, even as it managed bodies into separate entities that became about identity and not about the larger political effort of that third worldism. So and it seems that with the Biko movement, there was specifically something that was going on about rejecting exactly the management of bodies into defined racial categories, right? In the South African context, that was pushing against that. So I'm interested, I suppose, to hear about the question of failure of the multiplicity, whether you're honing in on the 70s because it's the moment when bodies are managed into these other forms, or where institutions take over and say, yes, we're hearing what you say, and we'll make ethnic studies rather than third world studies, yeah, so I think that's where I'm coming from. So yeah, I'll stop.
So let me try two responses. The first one is, well, first of all, just the recognition, as you say, the two movements that I was talking about were both defeated, the specific ones, but then even the vast other movements of the 1970s in various countries that have interested me, they were all defeated. And so even I, recently published this book about these movements, and one very sympathetic friend reading it said, Michael, all very inspiring and everything, but, they all failed. So my first response would be, for me, it's important to just first distinguish between failure and defeat. I understand failure as an internal flaw that was always there, and therefore and I understand defeat instead as recognizing that the external power is more powerful than us. Sometimes defeated militarily, by repression, etc. Sometimes defeated by much more insidious means, for instance, the ways that certain institutions, so all these were defeats, I said. Even what looked like a victory quickly often turned out to be defeat, which is the example you were giving there. So the first one, the question is about, I would want to say, was it a defeat or a failure? Because I have different responses to the two. And then the second one is, I think I have a version of this for myself, but I was thinking of a sentence that's often quoted in the introduction to Robin Kelly's Freedom Dreams, where he says something like, we shouldn't judge movements by standards of success or failure, we should judge them on the quality of their visions, or something like that. And I mean, I think that might be one way of approaching this, to say, you know, what was the quality of the vision of these movements, and in what ways could that quality be preserved, or you know, what I guess I have a slightly different way, but maybe it's the same thing as the Robin Kelly quote, which is to say that I think of it more like a relay race or something, like that, recognizing that they were able to carry something so far, and that we can start from where they did and carry it further, and that they become like a, what do you call it? I'm not sure, is a relay race a good one, like the passing the baton? I'm lacking the right metaphor. But something where, even though defeated, they had accomplishments, and that those accomplishments are something that we can find useful, or something like that. I'm perfectly comfortable with defeat. I mean, movements for liberation the last several hundred years have been defeated. You know, they've been massacred, they've been all kinds of, so if we were to exclude all the ones that were defeated, we wouldn't have much to think about. I mean, because, like I said, even the ones that seemed at certain moments like a glorious victory turned out in retrospect to, in some ways, have been defeated. Anyway, that was, I think it's a great point, and I'm only partially getting to it.
Wanted to return a little bit to your point, which because I do share often this suspicion, you know, like, just when certain groups are finally getting to the table, there is no more table, you know, like it seems a little bit like, oh, interesting, you know, in terms of the now there's no more hierarchy. Like it's been decades now. I mean, it's totally passé, this whole thing of horizontality, right? But you remember how many events we went to where like the and it was a claimed horizontality that as soon as you scratched the surface, there was a very clear hierarchy behind the political organizing or the artistic movement and so on. And so I do think it's a very healthy question to ask, you know, but at the same time, I respect the aspiration of like, of that ability to work across movements and say, yes, today we'll go to help this group because we're not more important. And the next day they will do the same, you know. So I don't know. It's an important question.
Is there any other urgent question? Otherwise, we maybe also should slowly wrap it up. I think in this, it was a multiplicity of of approaches we had, and I'm not sure if we retrospect have to maybe change the title of the evening a little bit, because but it's an interesting question how the bodies relate to it, and if they are just metaphorical or a placeholder or not. So I think in some way it connects, and I'm very happy that you were here. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much to you as well. And maybe we see each other online or in any other way again in this series. Thanks and goodbye.